You often.
95 have signed up, sight unseen. But with the embattled Microsoft under fire from the Justice Department and rival operating systems lining up for free distribution, analysts say Windows 2000 will need to prove itself more potent than Viagra to succeed. Joining us, somebody who doesn't use Viagra, our regular technology spot is, I think you don't, is Simon Moores. Now, why is Microsoft 2000 so important?
Windows 2000 is making a difference because the technology has moved on a great deal since Windows NT first came out 2 or 3 years ago. And of course, since then, we've had the arrival of the internet and many other advances in technology. So Windows 2000 is Microsoft's first attempt to actually dominate the enterprise side of the market, the side of the market which is most closely associated with Unix, with flavors of Unix which come out of companies like such as Sun Microsystems and Hewlett-Packard.
Sounds very technical.
Big boxes.
All right, big boxes. Okay, that's good. Right, fine. See, because my next question was going to be, well, given the virtual monopoly in any case, what's the problem?
Where Microsoft's concerned, Microsoft has a vision of having Windows everywhere. And at the moment, Windows is not up at the top of the enterprise. These are the large companies acting as web servers, acting to deal with electronic commerce, high processing transactions, and so on. Microsoft wishes to have a tremendous influence in that part of the market, as well as the lower end consumer end of the market too.
Right. Now, this sort of pre-release, which is happening this month, the beta software release of Windows 2000, what does that mean, beta software?
Well, it's an introductory release. Microsoft wishes to test the product out on its customers, and therefore Beta 3 is deemed to be the first stable release of the product, and so it's throwing it out to its many thousands of its customers to test it before it rolls out the first release to manufacturing around about October. The gold disc, in other words.
And they must hit that October date, must they?
There are very good reasons for hitting the October date, one being in the year 2000 Armageddon. If they don't actually hit the October date, then there's a very good chance that companies, businesses won't choose to use or install or migrate to Windows 2000 because they're far more concerned with what's going to be happening just around the corner at the end of the year.
Because some of the computer makers themselves are offering a rival, aren't they?
Yes, what's happened is many of Microsoft's closest partners are now starting to look at the Linux or Linux operating system. This is becoming increasingly popular. There's a tremendous amount of investment from companies such as IBM and Dell and Compaq Computer. It's an alternative. It's a server product, runs on big boxes, medium-sized boxes, and it's an alternative to Windows NT. It has yet to prove itself. It's popular as freeware. It doesn't have the same backing and support that Microsoft gives you with Windows 2000 and Windows NT.
How would the normal user notice the difference between what they have at the moment and Windows 2000? What is it, quicker, easier to use?
Windows 2000 is it's an evolution of Windows NT, which is the server operating system, departmental server operating system. The average user wouldn't probably notice a difference at the moment because the average consumer user is probably using Windows 95 or Windows 98. But in larger companies where they're using Windows NT, they need to migrate to a more advanced operating system which makes better use of the features that technology is starting to introduce. As an example, thin client technology, which means that rather than actually having all the power sitting on the box in your desk, you have the power sitting on a centralized server farm, and you actually end up with a dumb or a very simple terminal on your desk. And that sort of feature, which was driven very much by companies such as Citrix, are now built into Windows 2000.
You met Bill Gates last week when you were talking to him about his new book. What was his reaction to, for example, all the giveaways that are going on at the moment? Does he regard those as a threat to Microsoft?
I didn't actually get an opportunity to ask Bill Gates that question. But Microsoft, in terms, are you asking about the Internet Explorer or Linux?
Explorer, yes, yeah.
Microsoft has very successfully driven forward the evolution of its Internet Explorer. And in fact, yesterday I got the first release of Internet Explorer 5. So whereas in the past they were catching up with Netscape, their principal rival, and one of the reasons that they are facing the court battle in the United States with the Department of Justice, it could be argued that they've now overtaken the technology that Netscape first evolved and drove forward with Netscape Navigator, and with Internet Explorer 5 they have something which is particularly attractive to every user, whether it be a consumer user or the business user.
Sam, thanks so much indeed. We have to leave it there because some very important trade talks are taking place in Washington at the moment, and President Clinton's meeting the Chinese Premier, talking about very important things like
as their default browser, while at the same time they still offer Netscape's Navigator on the systems.
We used to think of Apple as being like Apple and PCs as being like Betamax and VHS. Now Apple, as you're saying, taking a completely different direction. They're producing thinner computers, aren't they? Is this the way forward?
Well, the world's changing, and I'm sure Jeff would agree with me on this one. We're seeing the advent of what we call thin client-server computing and the importance of being able to connect devices to the internet.
Yeah.
And Apple has identified that particular niche in the consumer market and has done so with the iMac. And at the other end of the market, with their OS 10 or their System 10 server, they're trying to produce the best possible Apache server. Apache is the most popular of the web servers out there and the cheapest. So Apple's identified this market slot very successfully.
Jeff, how important is, you talked a bit about the internet before Simon came in, but I can't see companies putting the whole of their systems onto the internet. I mean, that would be crazy, wouldn't it? But are we moving away from PCs, do you think?
No, we thought we were. Remember, there was this whole market craze around network computers, the ultimate thin client, and of course that failed to materialize in anywhere near the volume we talked about. Apple actually is not so much, in my view, not just about thin as it is about simplicity. You know, Apple's, sort of keystone, if you will, has always been ease of use.
Yeah.
It's still different than a PC, but it is easy to use. So I don't think we are moving away from the PC, but it is clearly, to Simon's point, becoming more and more network-centric. It's not just the internet, it's the internal, inward-looking intranet as well.
Is style and simplicity going to do a lot for Apple? It appears to be doing it at the moment with the iMac.
It's a lifestyle device. I mean, you've got an Apple, I've got an Apple. It appeals to the 30-something audience, but certainly Apple are producing faster.
They're laughing when you said 30-something, but carry on.
Okay. That's out of the younger audience. Yeah. But certainly it appeals to a particular audience. But speed, style and simplicity are Apple's watchwords at the moment, and they're certainly delivering that with their latest brand of systems.
Their weakness is marketing, isn't it, in this country?
Their weakness has always been marketing.
I mean, the ads have been good, but the marketing's just not that.
They've always hidden their lights under a bushel.
Yeah.
And I think Apple would admit so much themselves. They have good software, they have particularly good hardware, great technology, but they're not very good at shouting about it.
Jeff, Simon and I have often talked on this programme about trying to define where the computer business is in relation, say, to the telephone, where people are more giving away mobile phones now. There has been a move, hasn't there, to give PCs away. Do you see this increasing? Yeah,
there has been. In fact, if you think about it in comparative terms, it took something on the order of about 13 years for radio and something just twice that long for television to reach about the same size audience that the internet has reached today. So as a broadcast medium, the internet's a much faster growth engine than our traditional sort of communications programs have been, but it clearly seems to be continuing to accelerate.
And would you, if you're in a position to do it, buy from the portal companies the idea that ads around something is enough to make people actually buy off those ads, thus being able to offer free gifts on top of that?
It seems to be. In fact, portal, I would predict, is going to be one of the most important new watchwords or buzzwords in the industry, because we've once again gone from something fairly simple on the internet to mountains and junk heaps of documents that we can't mine successfully, and the notion of portals is creating the simplicity to navigate these things more easily. So once again, the sort of language and the usage models are changing, but it's all about the volumes of the internet in the end.
And finally, Simon, where's Microsoft as we stand at the moment? Because, I mean, they've taken it's all gone a bit quiet, hasn't it, obviously, because the court proceedings and so on. Are we going to see this breakup of Microsoft, do you think, in the end, that we've often talked about?
I don't think so, but at the same time, there are two separate actions. Of course, there's the Department of Justice against Microsoft, and there are 13 US states. And I think, and obviously Jeff is from the United States, that the more dangerous adversary for Microsoft are the 13 attorneys general in the United States, because they're the ones who have elections in mind, constituents in mind, and they want to prove their point. I'm sure you'll come in there. But
Well, I think that the whole significance of the antitrust engine underscores the significance of the maturity of this industry. I don't think there's been an antitrust action of this magnitude since the railroads.
Yeah.
Or
since Standard Oil.
Yeah. So without commenting about Microsoft's specific sort of challenges, because I'm not sure that would be fair, I'm certainly not the most objective voice in that. It probably, as much as anything, is an indication of just how significant this industry has become.
Jeff Pappower, Simon Moores, gentlemen, thanks so much indeed for joining us. Reading the economic runes is always a fraught business.
Let's take a look now at that clip from Chris Long's interview with Bill Gates. And joining me for a trip down memory lane, I'll have Steve Shipside and also Simon Moores, who's chairman of the Microsoft Windows NT Forum. We'll be talking in further detail about some of the Microsoft milestones and some of the issues raised by our interview. So, over to Chris Long and Bill Gates.
Maybe you could walk us through how it was that IBM came to you and asked you to write PC-DOS. And you became very famous.
It's a famous thing. Well, we were in every personal computer at that point. The Apple II, the Commodore, the TRS-80, these are the famous machines of the time. We weren't in Sinclair and one or two obscure others, but we were in most
Sinclair
of them.
wasn't obscure? It was British.
Well, it was a fine machine, but it didn't use our BASIC. In any case, so when IBM was putting together this tiny little task force to say, okay, let's dabble in this area, they came to us and said, hey, couldn't we work together? Because the main reason they were doing this task force was to prove that inside this huge company they could get a product done in a short period of time, not because they saw a big market. And the method they decided to use to get something done quickly was to rely on some outside companies. So Intel for the chips and Microsoft for the software. And we convinced them to do something outrageous, which was to use a 16-bit processor. And that was more powerful than the machines of the time. And so that machine became the model for this 16-bit era. In fact, most of the machines eventually became very, very compatible with that IBM machine. And so, with us providing the BASIC, the DOS, and everything, that really grew our business quite a bit.
The really big deal of Microsoft's success was the fact that you were allowed to make MS-DOS off the back of a PC-DOS and sell it to the growing clone market. Was that deal, that tick in the box from IBM, as big to you then as it really has become now?
Well, there are many milestones in our history. Getting BASIC up as a standard product in the 8-bit era. Then MS-DOS became our key product for many years there. And working with IBM was a key element of that. We knew when we structured that deal with IBM we were going to license it to everybody else, and we were very clear to them about that. That was the business we were in.
But two questions here. That was very unusual from IBM, wasn't it, that they would give you that? Did you know it was going to go meteoric the way it did?
Well, we believed that it would, even more than the people at IBM. It was a strange project in that sense, because we, as the provider of the software, had more enthusiasm about it than most people at IBM. Understand, this was a renegade project at IBM. It was a very small group, and only after the PC started to sell, about 10 times what they'd predicted, did they think, wow, how does this affect their strategy? They had to discontinue a number of products. They had a word processing product and a small business product, which the PC just wiped those things out. Then they put a lot of resources into it, eventually didn't move as fast as some of the other people, and lost the number one position that they'd had there. But we thought that machine would be a key machine, and Intel felt the same way. So that was where that partnership got going.
Everyone saw the writing on the wall except IBM, basically.
Well, no. Well, there were people at IBM who saw it, and it's easy to be optimistic when you're a small company like that, when you believe in something the way we did. The statement that we had about computing was so revolutionary. None of the computer companies would have believed that the key software would come from a non-computer company, from a pure software company run by some kids up in Seattle. I mean, that just wasn't in their mindset.
Was it a difficult decision to make to bring out Windows? Because you'd already got the market sewn up with DOS.
Well, we knew that things would change. That's the thing that's great about our business is none of the products we sell in any year are going to last more than 3 or 4 years. Now, if we do a good job, we can replace them with something more powerful. And so this idea that you just had characters on the screen versus having any type of image, so-called graphical interface, we fell in love with that idea. The pioneering work in the research lab had actually been done at Xerox. And there, even though they failed to productize it, that concept infected Apple, infected Microsoft, a number of other companies. We even hired a number of the top people from Xerox, people like Charles Simoni. And so we said, how can we do this? The problem was that the PCs were too slow. They didn't have enough memory. the processor wasn't fast enough, and it's a lot harder to do these graphical screens than just put the characters up there. So when we first came out with Windows, even though it took a lot longer to develop than we expected, it didn't really catch on. It took really until 1990 before people could say, hey, graphics interface, this is clearly the way things are going to go. This is the way software should be built. So we spent from 1985 till 1990 going around and saying, come on, get behind this. And even some of the other software companies were very, very slow to back the idea.
Is it fair to say that the PC itself was part of the problem? You say that it wasn't very powerful. The Macintosh had already got a graphical user interface and was actually making it work in about, 84, 85.
Well, yes and no. Remember that the 1984 Macintosh, which is a machine I love, actually stopped selling. It was a 128K machine, and so people could only do a few applications. It didn't have much storage. It didn't have expandability. And so even though they were very clever, I mean, Apple deserves immense credit for what they did, and they used that 68,000 processor, the machine was still limited. It was a little bit better than the Lisa, which had come before it and absolutely failed, but still graphical computing, even for Apple, didn't take off until probably 87, 88, where people saw this is there. It took laser printing. Adobe came along with PageMaker. We fleshed out all of our applications, including Excel, for the Macintosh. That was a big milestone there. And so in the 80s, we were all at risk, all of us who'd bet our companies on graphics interface. And then by 1990, it really started to pay off.
We're on to, now, what is the next version of Windows coming up?
We moved from the original Windows to Windows NT, which is the industrial strength Windows. And that was another one of those struggles where people said at first, you couldn't build something that had the power of Unix, but also the friendliness of a Windows-type system. So that's been a huge foundation for us. Now we need to take that and prove to people that even the biggest systems, where they would have used mainframes in the past, they can now use Windows, because the power of the chip and the capacities of these systems are quite incredible. And so we're building that kind of reliability and scalability in. So we're moving up to the very high end to do things on the internet where there's more transactions than you've ever had to deal with before. We're also moving down to the very small devices, a little palm-sized device that you carry in your pocket, something that you'd have in your TV set or in your car. And that's what we call Windows CE for the consumer side of things.
It sounds like Windows 2000 is Windows on steroids. Will you need a suitably powerful machine to run it?
Windows NT requires a bit of a more powerful machine. You can run it with 32 megabytes. Most people run it now with 64 megabytes, although that's becoming typical. About half of Windows in business today is now this more powerful version of Windows.
OK, let's talk about some of the issues arising from that interview. We have Steve Shipside and Simon Moore, Simon's of the Microsoft Windows NT Forum. They're joining me now. We're going to take a look at some of the history and find out whether Steve, in particular, thinks those milestones are pretty well in accord with his factual analysis of history rather than Bill Gates's. I guess I was interested in how praiseworthy he found Apple and how much praise he gave Xerox, and indeed how he talked quite warmly about IBM. Companies that one by one he's either discarded or fallen out with. Would you go broadly along with what he describes as the milestones, really, moving into the 16-bit era for the first part of the interview there?
Couldn't quibble with the milestones at all. He's very careful about what he says. However, the spin you might put in it would be a bit different. I don't think he plays up the fact that the decision by IBM to let him provide MS-DOS, which, in fact, PC-DOS as it was, which was a product he bought, he didn't create.
He bought it from the kids in Seattle.
Yeah, those kids in Seattle weren't really his own boys at all. It was QDOS, Quick and Dirty Operating System. That was the most insane piece of business luck probably in the whole history of any technology. That was the biggest break, and no one knew it.
So here you have IBM as really the big party. And this, I'm using words used to describe him by others. This geek comes along with this idea from a bunch of kids he met around the corner. And you're suggesting that IBM really let slip through their fingers a piece of magic.
Totally. Bill Gates is very, very good at seeing the main chance. He has an incredible skill for that. IBM weren't. They created something, and in fact, it's something of a wildcat division of IBM. Nobody, in the corporate sense of it, remember, they're big business in mainframes. They did not believe that the PC was going to be a big deal. It was a project, it was a trial. They could not have envisaged at the time, it's very easy with 2020 hindsight to see it all now, they did not at the time envisage that it would have wiped out half of their middle-range business. So they weren't that worried about it. There are various stories about how the decision actually came to be made. There's one that the man in question was unreachable, supposedly flying an airplane at the time, so they just gave it out of frustration to this kid Gates who was banging on their door. There's another that Gates' mother was on board with the man who green-lighted it from IBM as well. But the fact is, whichever way they went, they
on board the plane or on board in his basic
on a board.
idea.
Actually, on a board of directors. But, I mean, any way you look at it, it happened. Nobody thought too much about it from IBM's side, but Bill Gates was, to do him all credit, he saw the potential. He went in, he was negotiating before he even had a product to sell them. He then bought it, provided it, was very clever about licensing it. That talk of doing MS-DOS afterwards, being able to sell somebody a product and then run away with it still as your own and get a licensing deal out of it. He set the model there that Microsoft has since made so much money off.
Well, I think if it worked once, why not try it again? And then there was Apple, and Apple, without doubt, the market leader, a multitasking machine, although not as powerful as the machines that we're used to now. And even he, again, praised Apple. They came together, they start buying Microsoft products, or buying into Microsoft products, I should say, and then they go apart.
There are several features there. I mean, for a start, he's always been very good. Microsoft does not have a great history of innovating itself. It doesn't, and nor does it really claim to. What it's always done is cherry-pick from the best technologies around it. The Apple GUI was great. People loved it. Whatever he says there, it was actually quite a success. It was a real landmark, and it shaped, totally framed the way he then developed Windows. Windows 3.1 was the sincerest form of flattery, shall we say, undoubtedly.
Yeah, I think it would be fair to say that Windows 3.1 still remains the most popular package for a lot of people.
For a lot of people.
I found it extremely easy to use, still miss it in very many respects.
Both of them, of course, had lifted the idea of the GUI wholesale from the Palo Alto Research Center at Xerox, and they both acknowledged that. It wasn't their idea either.
You mentioned Xerox. I mean, Xerox, they just really... It was almost like Xerox, if they were a football team, had three of the best football players in the world, and they kept them on the substitutes bench. They had this great ability, did they not? But they just weren't interested in pursuing it.
Mr. Gates there, God bless him, and his cotton socks, he actually used the word productize, which is a new word on me. But, Xerox failed to productize. In other words, they failed to make any money. They had these brilliant ideas.
They had the technology.
Ethernet, the mouse, GUI, you name it, they had the ideas, and then people like Bill Gates came along and thought, wow, could I make money out of that? And did so. To their credit.
And you've got to take your hat off to Microsoft and Bill Gates in particular for that. And I can remember walking into offices where there were giant mainframes taking up an entire floor, and nobody upstairs could actually use computers. It was just the mainframe. And the fact that he saw the vision of the PC, I think, is all credit to him. Let's bring you in at this stage, Simon. One of the things that he's already talked about, let's look to the future now, is Windows 2000, and I think, 33 million lines of code, or is it 30,000 lines of code? A heck of a lot of codes.
That's a good guess. It's up probably around 33 million lines of code from about 17 million lines of code for Windows NT 4.
Now that's, to my mind, in there somewhere there must be some innovation. Is this a sign of things to come, that maybe Microsoft are no longer actually just basing their skills on proprietary spotting of who's good at what and then selling it, but actually starting to innovate and being creative? If you like, actually going back to where they came from in terms of what IBM would be, in the way IBM behaved. Are Microsoft going to start doing things for themselves now?
Yes and no. I mean, I guess it's the computer industry's equivalent of, shall we say, the Great Pyramid or even the Titanic. Windows NT 4 has been overtaken by the technology, in particular the Internet. And so over the last few years, we've seen Microsoft bolting on more and more features to Windows NT 4 to make it an enterprise operating system. And by an enterprise operating system, I mean an operating system which is capable of taking on something like Unix. And we mean an operating system which is robust, which is secure, which is available, and which can provide the sort of transaction processing levels that Gates described as an interview. So what Microsoft's doing is Microsoft is taking Windows NT, which started as an evolution of DOS, and moved on to the GUI and to ordinary Windows and became a departmental server operating system, to compete with Novell and NetWare. And they're taking it a step higher. They want to take the Unix market away from companies such as Sun and Hewlett-Packard. And the solution is Windows 2000, which should appear later on this year.
A great irony again, though, isn't it? Here you have Unix, which is getting a cult following in certain areas, is it not? And people are actually saying, fantastic, a gates-free zone, Unix. And yet it's not going to be a gates-free zone at all, is it?
Well, no. I mean, in terms of, are you talking about Linux or Linux
yes.
here rather than Unix in general? The Unix is obviously the area where the large companies invest most of their expenditure. Most of the larger servers, most of the transactions that you see taking place on the web are run on Unix boxes. In particular, most of the mail services run on Linux or Linux boxes. Consequently, the market is moving towards this freeware operating system, which is represented by Linux or Linux, and seeing the opportunity to make money out of services. Hence, we see Intel and IBM and Hewlett-Packard all plunging into support for Linux and Linux, and in particular because Microsoft doesn't own it. Microsoft respects and understands, through a statement by Steve Ballmer and even Bill Gates, that Linux is the weak spot, the Achilles heel for Microsoft, because it offers the market something which Microsoft no longer dominates. At the same time, Microsoft is now innovating. It respects and understands that the end point of personal computing is no longer Windows 2000 or Windows. And that's why we're seeing over the last few weeks the investment in AT&T maybe with Media One, $5 billion possibly going in there, a possible investment with cable and wireless, maybe $3 billion, to try and dominate what we call the broadband market, getting the internet into homes. Microsoft wants to dominate that market too.
Now, with regard to 2000, when is it ever going to appear? You know, by the way, I mean, you know, I keep hearing about it. But why are people so worried about the migration from existing NT to Windows 2000?
Well, there's a couple of factors. Firstly, Windows 2000 is Microsoft's universal year 2000 solution. So you're really being rather led by the nose. If you want to make sure that you are in a year 2000 risk-free zone, then you really have no option but to move your environment into Windows 2000. The beta for Windows 2000 appeared, I believe, last week.
Right.
I was on holiday. We expect that the full product should ship in October, and this is particularly risky for Microsoft because October takes us towards the end of the year, and analysts predict that possibly we'll see a slowdown in the hardware market and in the software market as companies tighten their belts, close the hatches and start worrying about the year 2000 issue. So if Microsoft doesn't hit that October time slot for the server version of Windows 2000, then it could see its revenues decline dramatically over the last quarter.
It's got a very important deadline coming up.
Very much so.
But largely speaking, is there an existing worry zone about the year 2000, which includes actually some of the later software packages coming out of Microsoft, which will be wiped away, as it were, with NT 2000?
Not exclusively. I mean, where Windows 2000 is concerned, if you speak to many of my members of the Windows NT forum and other customers out there, they know that the beta of Windows 2000 is pretty robust and pretty scalable. But the problem is, I guess, a belief in Microsoft historically. Microsoft, on a historical basis, has failed to produce a bug-free operating system in every 0.0 release. And
so if you talk the third release, it gets about sorted out.
That's Service Pack 1, Service Pack 2. So if you talk to customers out there, many of them are committed to Windows 2000. But over the last 12 months, and since we took a survey in March of our members, whereas a year ago 80% said they would move to Windows 2000 automatically, a survey we did in March showed only 30% said automatically.
You know, wait and see. It's the best policy, generally speaking, as far as Microsoft. Very finally, with you, Steve, and briefly too, the consumer end of the market, Windows CE, is he across everything with regard to the little pocket users, but also the PC demands and the minor consumer? Is he across that too?
Well, he wants to be, but it's a bit tougher for him. He's hamstrung by the legacy of Windows, which was frankly a fat operating system. He needs something a bit more svelte. And some of the other people starting from scratch have got an advantage on him there. It will still be interesting to see what comes out of people like Symbian. But that said, I mean, there's more money down the back of this man's sofa than you or I are going to earn in a lifetime. So I imagine he's going to put that worry in perspective.
OK, Steve, thanks very much. Thank you indeed to Simon. Time for a break. Coming after that, Peter.
To tell us more about what we can expect from this trial is Dr. Simon Moores. He's the chairman of the research company. Now, Simon, we've seen that we've had 24 witnesses since October giving their version of events. Do you think IBM's testimony is really going to make a difference?
Not a huge amount. The Justice Department obviously needs a big hitter, and IBM is one of them. they've dragged in Compaq, they've dragged in just about everybody they can to contribute to the case. What they're trying to do is conclusively prove that Microsoft has been acting unfairly, anti-competitively and illegally. And it really depends where you stand. I mean, either Microsoft's been acting as a true altruist and making software available to the world at very, very generous prices, or it's been acting like a railroad baron of the last century. And in the eyes of the Consumer Federation of America, they believe that Microsoft's overcharged consumers by about $15 billion over the last 5 years or so.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because there could be an argument that the US government is using this case to explore a much wider antitrust scenario, and the fact they're looking into American Airlines, Intel and companies such as that.
This is true because antitrust legislation was probably framed in the United States around about 1912 and 1914, something that's called the Clayton Antitrust Laws. They described the atmosphere which existed in the environment of the American West, cattle barons, railroad barons, and during the boom of the early 20th century. Now they're very concerned that they have to define a means of dealing with these very large multinational companies in the 21st century. And Microsoft is very much like a stalking horse.
In the meantime, this does not seem to be affecting Microsoft at all. As we just saw on the screen, their shares at $80 and 11.16. So the company continues to go from strength to strength.
Oh, most certainly. Microsoft still makes excellent software. It still has this monopoly hold on the operating system world of the personal computer. And with Windows 2000 due in October, it will take that next leap up into what we call the enterprise side, competing directly with Sun and HP's Unix. Microsoft looks set to do very well indeed. Whether the influence or the impact of the government case will filter through, we won't see anything until next year, remains to be seen.
Simon, briefly, it's been a long-running battle. When can we expect some sort of judgment or final decision on all this?
Well, people are saying that by the time the judge is deliberated, it's going to take at least another year. So I wouldn't expect something before the mid to end 2001 before any resolution of this case whatsoever.
OK, well, it sounds like a long-running dispute. But, of course, some are saying that there's so much evidence going on at the moment that they're wondering what the government's focus is actually on this case at this time.
I think at this moment in time, the government is focusing very much on the consumer issue. Has, again, Microsoft been acting illegally with its alleged monopoly control of the operating system? But more importantly, has the consumer suffered? Have they been paying too much money? And it's been argued that Microsoft's interest dictates that people pay at least $100 for the operating system. And that prevents the market managing to push out cheaper computing to the world at large. OK, Dr. Simon Moore, thank you very much for joining us today. Dr. Simon Moore from the research company.
And that's all for Europe Tonight. Up next,
voicemail. And now more and more companies are using email and the internet as means of communicating both with customers and suppliers. But the signs are that it's not making the lives of office workers any easier. Today's research shows half of British workers are reporting that they're interrupted by new messages every 10 minutes. In many workplaces, well over half the messages are from people within the same department. For a lot of staff, email is a new tool. 42% of workers in the survey started using it within the last year, and that may mean they've not learnt to use it well. Dr. Simon Moores, a computer industry consultant, says faster communication doesn't always make us work more efficiently.
More and more people are competing for your personal space. The world is becoming increasingly intrusive. Consequently, you're becoming more and more pressed to return calls, get back to more people, and it becomes more and more of a barrier to actually do the job you're paid to do.
The research shows office workers are finding ways of dealing with excessive information. They're simply ignoring some phone messages and throwing away some of their email without even opening it. Rory Kathleen-Jones, BBC News.
It's 8:15 now. Any job is hard to come by for many black.
The courtrooms of the US have ever seen are over, and now Bill Gates' Microsoft and the US Justice Department are at it again. And while they take up the cudgels, there's increasing evidence that those who actually are using computers and the internet are not, as you might expect, speeding e-commerce at the speed of light, but to put it politely, messing around and messing business up. Two subjects with us as usual to browse, surf and search, Dr. Simon Moores. Simon, let's talk about Microsoft first. What has been established so far?
Very little in many respects. It's a bit like Godfather 2. If you try and distill the case down into, shall we say, 6 points, it's, does Microsoft indeed have a monopoly on the operating system? That's number one. Has Microsoft been acting illegally, which is the important point, as regards tying the contract for its Internet Explorer to sale of its operating system? Is Windows a single product or two products? And it goes on from there. But Microsoft's answer these days is that the AOL-Sun Netscape deal proves that Microsoft does not have a monopoly situation in the market, and that, again, Microsoft's been acting in the best interest of consumers.
We're going to hear more about that, presumably, now, are we?
Yes, what's happening at the moment is that each side in the case now has the opportunity to present 3 rebuttal witnesses.
Okay.
And this is their opportunity to argue the case through, to bring up even more detail, and for the judge to listen to it, consider it, and at some point in the future reach a verdict. But people are saying that we won't see anything near a verdict until October of next year.
So it's in Microsoft's interest to spin this out, presumably, as it has been all along.
Oh, very much so. And as the argument becomes more convoluted, and as the industry evolves and progresses, then Microsoft probably has a stronger case. I mean, indeed, these days, Microsoft is now arguing that because America Online, Sun and Netscape have got together, that this is indeed proof that there is no real monopoly situation in the industry.
And we're going to hear about a previous spat with IBM, presumably in 94-95.
Yes, this is rather sordid and unhappy. What's been suggested is that because IBM owns Lotus Development and Lotus Notes and supported Netscape with the Netscape Navigator browser, Microsoft allegedly punished them by charging them more to bundle Windows with IBM products than it did, for example, with Compaq, some 40% more.
Okay, the stage is set. We'll be talking about this over the coming months and weeks, no doubt. Wasting time on computers, browsing when you shouldn't be. This is a lot of business lost, isn't it?
A great deal. I mean, just going back to a survey that I believe Nielsen Media took this year, they looked at the Playboy site, a popular site in the United States, and they found that 80% of the hits on the Playboy site came from Fortune 500 companies. And not many people know that many of these sites, when you visit them, they'll record your address, they'll have your number.
Yeah.
And so this can be potentially embarrassing to large companies if they're hitting, for example, a pornographic site, an X-rated site, and you can see that it's coming from well-known companies in the industry.
Yeah. And also, I mean, some of the software actually has games built into it, doesn't it? Like Minesweeper and things like that. And
yes.
Naturally, in this office, we never do anything like that. But I've been into offices where I've seen lots of people doing that. It's wasting time.
It's an evolution of the problem people or companies had with solitaire when Windows first came out. A lot of time was spent with employees playing solitaire. Nowadays, what's happening, of course, is we have this rather interesting device which accesses the internet in front of us. And a lot of employee time, it's suggested, is being spent on the internet.
It's the world at your fingertips, isn't it? I mean, what do people expect? And how can this be guarded against? Is there anything you can...
Well, there are certain software devices, hardware devices you can use to try and limit access or control employees' access to the internet. But the point of concern is one for business. I mean, the Wall Street Journal looked at this recently. And another survey also suggested that if employees spend 1 hour of their day accessing the internet, that's 12% of your payroll down the drain.
Back to typewriters, Simon. Thanks very much indeed.